Sometimes we travel great distances to find the very thing our hearts have been missing all along. When grief becomes too heavy to carry alone, we make choices that once seemed impossible. Wealthy widow Evelyn Hargrave stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Pine Ridge, Montana, carrying only her late sister's secret letters. The letters spoke of a mountain man named Patch McKenna. Evelyn had fled her empty Boston mansion to find this man who had somehow touched her sister's heart. But the grizzled, one-eyed stranger chopping firewood behind a weathered cabin was nothing like she expected. Patch was older, quieter, carrying scars deeper than the missing eye. As winter snow began to fall, Evelyn realized she may have traveled 2,000 miles to find something far more unexpected than adventure. What could her refined sister have possibly seen in this broken mountain hermit? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a final, bone-jarring halt outside McCready's general store, and Evelyn Hargrave felt the last vestiges of her carefully ordered world slip away like morning mist. Through the dust-caked window, she glimpsed a settlement that bore no resemblance to the manicured streets of Boston's Beacon Hill. Pine Ridge, Montana Territory, consisted of perhaps 20 weathered buildings scattered along a single mud-rutted street dwarfed by towering mountains that scraped the belly of grey October clouds. "End of the line, ma'am," called the driver, his voice rough from tobacco and mountain air. "Sure you got the right place?" Evelyn pressed Clara's locket, a delicate gold piece containing a pressed wildflower, against her chest and nodded. She had been asking herself that same question for the past 2 weeks of grueling travel, but turning back now would mean accepting that her sister's final years remained forever mysterious. The letters in her carpet bag, written in Clara's familiar script, spoke of transformation, of finding something precious in this harsh landscape. Evelyn needed to understand what that something was. The Boston she had left behind 3 weeks ago felt like another lifetime. Her sprawling Beacon Hill mansion, inherited from her late husband Charles, stood empty, except for the household staff who moved through its rooms like ghosts, tending a mausoleum. The morning she decided to leave, Evelyn had stood in her silk-papered drawing room, surrounded by crystal decanters and Persian rugs worth more than most families earned in a year, and felt suffocated by the weight of everything she was expected to be. "Mrs. Hargrave," her sister-in-law Victoria had said during that final visit, settling her considerable bulk into the imported French settee, "this notion of traveling west is simply unseemly. Charles has been gone 2 years now. It's time you considered remarrying within our circle. The Whitmore boy would be quite suitable." The Whitmore boy was 43 years old, had buried 2 wives already, and possessed all the charm of wet newspaper. But he owned 3 textile mills and maintained the proper social connections in Boston society that counted for considerably more than kindness or compatibility. Evelyn had smiled politely and served tea in her grandmother's china, but that night she had pulled Clara's letters from their hiding place beneath her jewelry box and read them again by candlelight. Clara, 3 years older and infinitely bolder, had vanished from Boston society as completely as if she had been swallowed by the earth. One morning, her rooms at the family estate were empty, her trunks gone, leaving only a brief note saying she had found something worth pursuing in the Western Territories. The family had been scandalized. Unmarried women of their station simply did not disappear into the wilderness. They made appropriate marriages, managed households, and attended charitable committees. They certainly did not abandon silk gowns for calico and trade parlor conversations for whatever crude society existed beyond civilization's boundaries. But Clara's letters, arriving sporadically over 3 years, painted a different picture. She wrote of mountain sunrises that set the sky ablaze, of communities where a person's worth was measured by their character rather than their bank balance, of a freedom she had never imagined possible. And most intriguingly, she wrote of a man named Patch McKenna, describing him in terms that made Evelyn's heart ache with something she could not name. He is not what you would expect, Clara had written in her final letter, received just 2 months ago. War has marked him, as it has marked so many. But beneath the scars lives a gentleness that would surprise you. He sees the world as it truly is, not as society demands we pretend it to be. There is honesty here, Evelyn, of a kind we never knew existed. Now, stepping down from the stagecoach onto the muddy planks that served as Pine Ridge's sidewalk, Evelyn wondered if she had been a fool to come. Her traveling dress, modest by Boston standards, still marked her as hopelessly out of place among the practical wool and leather garments of the frontier women who hurried past. Her small leather boots, designed for drawing-room floors, squelched unpleasantly in the October mud. "You'll be wanting Martha's boarding house," the stage driver said, hefting her trunk down with unnecessary force. "Only respectable place for a lady, though I got to say, ma'am, this ain't exactly a tourist destination." Martha Kellerman's boarding house proved to be a 2-story structure of weathered pine, distinguished from its neighbors mainly by the hand-painted sign that swayed in the mountain wind. Mrs. Kellerman herself answered Evelyn's knock, a woman of perhaps 50 years, with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "Mrs. Hargrave, I presume," Martha said, looking Evelyn up and down with frank assessment. "Doc Harrison said you might be coming. You're Clara's sister." The way she said Clara's name with warmth tinged by sadness told Evelyn that her sister had made an impression here. "Yes, I've come to find out about Patch McKenna," Martha finished. "Clara spoke of you often, said you had more spine than Boston let you show. Come in, then. You'll want coffee and a hot meal before you do anything foolish." The boarding house's front parlor was simply furnished, but clean, with rag rugs covering wide plank floors and a stone fireplace that radiated welcome warmth. Martha seated Evelyn at a pine table and brought thick coffee in a blue enamel cup, along with bread that tasted of honest grain rather than the refined flour Evelyn was accustomed to. "Your sister," Martha began, settling into the opposite chair, "was special. Not many Eastern ladies adapt to mountain life, but Clara took to it like she'd been born here. Had a way with the children, helped Doc Harrison with the sick folks, could cook a decent meal from whatever was available. Most importantly, she understood that out here, pretense will get you killed." "What happened to her?" Evelyn asked, though she dreaded the answer. Martha's weathered face softened. "Fever. Last winter. Came on fast and hard. Patch did everything he could, brought her down to Doc Harrison, sat with her for 3 days straight. But sometimes the mountain takes what it wants, and there's no arguing with it." Evelyn felt something cold settle in her stomach. In all her imagining of this journey, she had never seriously considered that Clara might be dead. Difficult to reach, perhaps. Changed, certainly, but not gone entirely from the world. "Patch blamed himself," Martha continued. "Still does, I reckon. He's always been a solitary man, but losing Clara near broke him. Hasn't been to town more than twice since the funeral. Just stays up in that cabin of his, chopping wood and nursing his grief." Through the boarding house window, Evelyn could see the mountains rising like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Somewhere up there, in a cabin she could not yet imagine, lived the man her sister had loved. The man who might hold the key to understanding what Clara had found in this wild place that had made her abandon everything familiar. "I need to see him," Evelyn said. Martha studied her with eyes that had seen their share of heartbreak and foolishness. "You could write a letter. I could have someone take it up to him." "No." The word came out more firmly than Evelyn had intended. "I've traveled 2,000 miles. I need to understand what my sister found here. I need to know why she stayed." "And you think Patch McKenna can tell you that?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, soft and pale from a lifetime of leisure. "He's the only one who can." Martha nodded slowly. "Then you'll need different clothes. And boots that won't get you killed on mountain trails. And most importantly, you'll need to understand that Patch isn't some romantic figure from a dime novel. War damaged him in ways that go deeper than the missing eye. He's a good man, but he's carrying burdens that would crush most folks. As evening settled over Pine Ridge, Evelyn sat in her small boarding house room and unpacked Clara's letters. Reading them again in this place where they had been written, she began to see nuances she had missed. Clara had not simply found adventure in the wilderness, she had found herself. The woman who emerged from these pages was stronger, more capable, more genuinely happy than the sister Evelyn remembered from Boston drawing rooms. Outside her window, the mountains loomed against a star-filled sky, unlike anything visible through Boston's gaslit haze. Somewhere up there, a man named Patch McKenna was probably sitting by his own fire, perhaps thinking of the woman he had lost. Tomorrow, Evelyn would begin the journey to find him. Tonight, she could only wonder if she possessed even a fraction of the courage that had carried her sister so far from home. The wildflower in Clara's locket, pressed flat and delicate, seemed to whisper of transformation and sacrifice. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring, but her Boston-bred imagination proved inadequate to the task. She could only trust that somewhere in the morning's light she would find the first steps toward understanding the mystery of her sister's choices. The mountains kept their secrets, but Evelyn had come too far to turn back now. The trail to Patch McKenna's cabin wound through pine forests that seemed to swallow sound itself. Evelyn's borrowed boots, sturdy leather things that Martha had procured from somewhere, crunched through frost-stiffened leaves as she followed the directions Doc Harrison had reluctantly provided. Her breath formed small clouds in the thin mountain air, and more than once she paused to rest, her Boston soft lungs struggling with the altitude. Martha had insisted she take a pack horse loaded with supplies, claiming it was payment for medical services. Clara had provided the previous winter. The truth, Evelyn suspected, was that the mountain community took care of its own, and by extension, took care of those connected to their own. It was a kindness she had never experienced in Boston society, where charity came with strings and expectations. The cabin appeared suddenly, through a break in the trees, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney from which a thin column of smoke rose straight up in the still air. A small barn and several outbuildings clustered nearby, and everywhere were signs of meticulous care. Neatly stacked cordwood, repaired fence rails, tools hung precisely on pegs under the barn's overhang. This was not the dwelling of a broken hermit, but of a man who found purpose in ordered work. Behind the cabin, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood echoed against the mountainside. Evelyn tied the pack-horse to a hitching post and walked around the building, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. Patch McKenna stood with his back to her, bringing the axe down in smooth, powerful strokes that spoke of decades of practice. He was smaller than she had imagined, perhaps 5 feet and 10 inches, with graying brown hair that touched his collar and shoulders that, while broad, carried the slight stoop of a man past 50. When he turned at the sound of her approach, Evelyn felt her breath catch. The missing left eye was immediately apparent, covered by a leather patch that had been darkened by years of weather and wear. But it was his remaining eye, steel gray and deeply intelligent, that held her attention. Here was a man who had seen too much and carried the weight of it in every line of his weathered face. "You're Clara's sister," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had been expecting this moment. "She said you might come." Evelyn found her voice with effort. "Mr. McKenna, I'm Evelyn Hargrave. I received Clara's letters. She's dead." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Patch set the axe head against a chopping block and studied Evelyn with that single penetrating eye. "Fever took her last February. Nothing Doc Harrison or I could do about it." The simple brutality of the statement hit Evelyn harder than she had prepared for. In all her planning for this journey, she had imagined finding Clara changed, perhaps, or choosing to remain in the wilderness, but not simply gone from the world entirely. "I know," she managed. "Martha told me. I'm sorry for your loss." Something flickered across Patch's face. Surprise, perhaps, or pain, before the careful blankness returned. Your loss, too, I reckon. She spoke of you often. What did she say? Patch was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Evelyn's face to the mountains beyond, as if seeking guidance from the peaks themselves. When he spoke again, his voice carried a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. She said, "You were the one person in Boston who understood that there was more to life than what society demanded. Said you just needed someone to show you the door." Evelyn felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This was not how she had imagined this conversation would begin. "She wrote about you. In her letters, she cared for you very much." The careful control in Patch's expression cracked slightly. He turned away, ostensibly to examine the pile of split wood, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the axe handle. "Your sister was a good woman," he said finally. "Better than a broken-down old soldier deserved, but she chose to stay here, chose to." His voice caught, and he stopped speaking entirely. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Evelyn found herself studying this man her sister had loved, trying to reconcile the gentle tone she heard in his voice with the harsh lines of his face, the careful distance he maintained. "She was living here," Evelyn said. It was not a question. Patch's jaw tightened. "She had been for near 2 years. Came up here after that first winter in town, said she preferred the quiet. I told her it wasn't proper, unmarried woman staying with a man like me, but Clara..." He stopped, shaking his head. "Clara did what Clara wanted to do. And what you wanted too," Evelyn said softly. The single eye that met hers was filled with such raw pain that Evelyn had to resist the urge to step back. "What I wanted was to keep her safe. Failed at that, didn't I?" There was something in his voice, self-loathing, mixed with grief, that told Evelyn this man had been carrying the weight of Clara's death like a physical burden. She thought of the meticulously maintained cabin, the precise stacks of firewood, the obsessive order that spoke of a mind trying to control what it could in a world that had taken away what mattered most. "Martha says you blame yourself. Martha talks too much." But there was no real anger in it, just weariness. "Clara got sick helping the Brennan family when their youngest took fever. I should have stopped her from going down there, should have known she'd catch it herself." "Could you have stopped her?" Patch almost smiled at that, a brief quirk of his mouth that transformed his face entirely. "No. No more than you could stop the sun from rising. Clara Hargrave did what she believed was right, consequences be damned." The way he said her name with reverence and exasperation and deep, abiding love made Evelyn's chest tight with emotion. This was what Clara had found in the wilderness, a man who knew her completely and loved her anyway, who let her be exactly who she was without trying to reshape her into what society demanded. "I brought some of her things," Evelyn said. "Martha thought perhaps you'd want them." For the first time since she had arrived, Patch looked directly at the packhorse and the supplies Martha had loaded. His expression shifted, becoming guarded again, as if he were bracing himself for another blow. "What kind of things?" "Her music box, some books, letters she'd written but never sent." Evelyn hesitated, then forged ahead. "A quilt she was working on. Martha said she'd been making it for your cabin." Patch turned away again, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You shouldn't have come all this way just to bring me reminders of what I lost." "I didn't come just for that," Evelyn said. "I came because I need to understand." Clara left. "Everything our family, her inheritance, a life of comfort and security to be here with you. I need to know what she found that was worth all of that." "And you think I can tell you?" "I think you're the only one who can." Patch was quiet for so long that Evelyn wondered if he intended to answer at all. The afternoon light was already beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the clearing, and she realized with a start that she had not thought beyond this conversation. She had no plan for where to spend the night, no clear idea of how to get back to town in the growing darkness. Finally, Patch sighed, a sound that seemed to carry years of accumulated pain. Clara found herself here, found out who she was when nobody was telling her who she ought to be. But that's not something I can show you, Mrs. Hargrave. That's something you've got to discover on your own. He looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in her borrowed clothes and city-soft hands, and the determined set of her jaw that was so much like her sister's. Question is, are you brave enough to do the looking? Or are you just going to take those things back to town and catch the next stage to Boston? Evelyn met his gaze steadily, despite the challenge she heard in his voice. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm here now, and I'm not ready to leave. Something shifted in Patch's expression, not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of respect. He nodded once, sharply, and picked up his axe. Then you'd better start by helping me get this wood stacked before dark. Mountain winter doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. That night, Evelyn sat by the fire in Martha's boarding house parlor, Clara's unfinished quilt spread across her lap. The fabric told a story of transformation. The bottom corner showed delicate silk squares in shades of rose and ivory, the kind of material Clara would have worn to Boston tea parties. But as the pattern progressed upward, the silk gave way. To sturdy cotton, then to practical wool, and even some rough homespun that must have come from local families. She was learning, Martha said, settling into the chair opposite with her own mending. First year she was here, Clara couldn't boil water without burning it. By the end, she could preserve vegetables, smoke meat, and deliver a baby if Doc Harrison wasn't available. Clara delivered babies? Evelyn looked up from the quilt, trying to reconcile this image with her memory of her sister fainting at the sight of blood during a minor kitchen accident. 3 of them, last count. Mountain women don't have the luxury of delicate constitutions. Martha's needle moved steadily through a sock that had seen better days. Your sister figured that out fast. Had to, if she wanted to be useful up here. Evelyn traced the pattern of the quilt with one finger, noting how Clara's stitching had grown more confident as the work progressed. Near the top, where the fabric became purely practical mountain wool, the needlework was as fine as anything their Boston seamstress could have produced. What was she like? Here, I mean. Was she happy? Martha's hands stilled. Happier than I've ever seen a person be. Oh, she missed things about her old life. Talked about the library in your family's house, the gardens, certain foods. But it was like watching someone who'd been holding their breath for years finally get to breathe. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of the hard winter everyone seemed to be preparing for. Did she talk about me? Every day? Near about? Worried about you something fierce? Said you were too smart and too good-hearted for Boston society, but too dutiful to leave on your own. Martha looked up from her mending, studying Evelyn with frank assessment. Said you'd been taking care of everyone else your whole life and never learned to take care of yourself. The words hit closer to home than Evelyn was comfortable with. She had spent her marriage managing Charles's social obligations, smoothing over his business conflicts, ensuring his comfort in every detail. After his death, she had seamlessly transitioned to managing his estate, his remaining business interests, and the expectations of 2 families' worth of relatives. She sent me letters, Evelyn said, but they never said much about her daily life, just impressions really, descriptions of sunrises and the way the mountains looked in different seasons. Clara was always better at seeing beauty than describing practicalities. She'd spend an hour watching light change on the peaks, then burn dinner because she forgot she was cooking. Martha smiled at the memory. Patch learned to check the stove when she got that dreamy look. The mention of Patch brought back the day's encounter, his guarded hostility, his obvious grief, the way his face had transformed when he spoke Clara's name. Evelyn had spent the afternoon helping him stack firewood, working in companionable silence, broken only by his occasional instruction about proper technique. His hands, she had noticed, were scarred and calloused, but moved with surprising gentleness when handling the split logs. What happened to his eye? Martha's expression grew more serious. War injury, shrapnel from an artillery shell, near as anyone can tell. He doesn't talk about it much, but Doc Harrison says he was lucky not to lose more than he did. And before the war? That's a longer story. Martha set down her mending and leaned back in her chair. Patch McKenna's people were among the first settlers in this valley. His grandfather built the original cabin site. His father expanded it. Patch was set to inherit a good spread of land and a decent living. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But the war took more than his eye. Lost his younger brother at Gettysburg, his father to grief not long after. When Patch came home, he found the land had been sold for taxes and his mother had moved back east to live with relatives. Everything he'd expected his life to be was just gone. Evelyn thought of the meticulous order she had observed at Patch's cabin, the way he had treated every tool and board with respect. So he rebuilt. From nothing, worked other men's claims for wages, saved every penny, bought back pieces of his family's land bit by bit. That cabin he's in now, he built every log of it with his own hands. Took him near 15 years to get back what had been lost. The picture Martha painted was of a man who understood loss intimately, who had fought his way back to stability through sheer determination. No wonder Clara's death had hit him so hard he had lost everything once already. The townspeople seemed to care about him. They do. Patch has pulled half the families in this valley out of trouble at one time or another. Bad winter, broken equipment, sick livestock, he shows up with whatever's needed and never expects repayment. Your sister used to say he collected strays. Martha smiled. I think that's how he saw Clara at first. Another lost soul who needed helping, but it became more than that. Much more. Took them both by surprise, I think. Clara came up here still carrying herself like a Boston lady, all careful manners and proper speech. Patch treated her like she was made of spun glass, afraid his rough ways would break her. Took them months to figure out they were both stronger than they looked. Evelyn folded the quilt carefully, running her hands over the progression of fabrics that told the story of her sister's transformation. Tomorrow she would return to Patch's cabin, bringing Clara's belongings as she had promised. But tonight, she wanted to understand what she was walking into. Martha, may I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Coming here, trying to understand what Clara found. Everyone back home thinks I've lost my mind. Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying Evelyn with eyes that seemed to see more than most people cared to look for. Your sister asked me the same question, her first week here, said she'd left everything she'd ever known and wasn't sure if she was brave or just foolish. What did you tell her? That sometimes brave and foolish look exactly the same from the outside. The difference is whether you're running towards something worth having or running away from something you're afraid to face. Martha picked up her mending again. Clara was running towards something. Question is, what are you doing? Evelyn considered this as she prepared for bed in her small room upstairs. Through the window, she could see the mountains outlined against a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible that the same sky covered Boston. Somewhere up there, Patch McKenna was probably sitting by his own fire, perhaps holding some memento of Clara, perhaps simply staring into the flames and remembering. She was running towards something, Evelyn realized, not away from Boston's suffocating expectations, but toward an understanding of what it meant to choose authenticity over comfort. Clara had found herself in these mountains, had discovered a strength and purpose that her old life had never demanded. The question was whether Evelyn possessed the courage to attempt the same journey of discovery, and whether a man like Patch McKenna could be trusted to help her find the way. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting the boarding house windows in delicate patterns that would have inspired the finest Boston artisans. Evelyn dressed carefully in her borrowed mountain clothes, wool skirt, sturdy blouse, and the leather boots that were already beginning to feel less foreign on her feet. She had arranged Clara's belongings in a canvas pack, the music box, several books, and most importantly, the letters Clara had written, but never sent. The trail to Patch's cabin seemed shorter this second time, perhaps because she knew what to expect at the end of it. Or perhaps because part of her was genuinely eager to see him again, to continue the conversation that had been interrupted by nightfall and her own uncertainty. She found him behind his workshop, a small building she had not noticed the previous day. Through the open door, she could see hand-carved furniture chairs, tables, and cabinets that displayed a level of craftsmanship that would have been prized in Boston's finest homes. The tools, hanging on the workshop walls, were not crude frontier implements, but precisely maintained instruments that spoke of decades of skill and care. "You're back," Patch said without looking up from the chair he was sanding. His voice carried neither welcome nor dismissal, simply acknowledgement of fact. "I brought Clara's things, as I promised." Evelyn set down the pack and waited, unsure of the protocol for this situation. In Boston, there would have been prescribed rituals for such exchanges, proper words and gestures that smoothed over the awkwardness of grief and loss. Here, she sensed, such artifices would be seen as insulting. Patch set down his sandpaper and turned to face her. In the morning light, she could see more clearly the lines that suffering had carved around his eye, the premature grey in his hair. But she could also see the strength in his hands, the careful intelligence in the way he observed her. "Before I look at those," he said, "I've got something to show you." He led her into the cabin, which proved to be larger and more comfortable than its rustic exterior suggested. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and furniture that matched the quality of the pieces she had seen in his workshop. Everything was scrupulously clean and organized, but there was a lived-in quality that spoke of genuine home rather than mere shelter. "Clara's room," Patch said, opening a door she had assumed led to storage. Evelyn stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The small room had been preserved exactly as Clara must have left it. A simple bed with a quilt Evelyn recognized from childhood covered the mattress. Clara's books, volumes of poetry and philosophy that had scandalized their Boston relatives, sat neatly arranged on a shelf. Most touching of all, Clara's everyday clothes hung on pegs along one wall, practical dresses and working aprons that showed the wear of honest labor. "You kept everything. Couldn't bring myself to change it." Patch stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Probably should have, but it felt like admitting she was really gone." Evelyn touched the sleeve of one of Clara's dresses, noting how the fabric had been carefully mended in several places. Her sister, who had never so much as hemmed a handkerchief in Boston, had learned to maintain her own clothing, to make do and repair rather than simply replace. She was happy here, Evelyn said, and it was not a question. Happiest I ever saw anyone be. Used to sing while she worked little songs she'd make up about the weather or the mountains or whatever nonsense struck her fancy. Drove me half crazy at first, all that chatter when I was used to quiet. But then... He stopped, shaking his head. "But then you missed it when she was gone." "Miss it still." Patch's voice was so quiet she almost missed the words. "House feels dead without her noise." They returned to the main room, where Evelyn unpacked Clara's belongings with careful reverence. The music box, when opened, played a delicate waltz that seemed almost absurdly refined in the cabin's rustic setting. Patch listened to the entire melody without speaking, his scarred hands resting motionless on the table. "She used to play this every night before bed," he said finally. "Said it reminded her of dancing with you when you were children." Evelyn's throat tightened. She remembered those evenings in the family's drawing room, Clara leading her through careful steps while their governess played piano. It seemed impossible that the woman who had treasured such memories could be the same person who had learned to smoke meat and deliver babies in a mountain cabin. "The letters," Evelyn said, pulling out a tied bundle. "Martha thought you should have them." Patch took the packet with obvious reluctance. "What kind of letters?" "Ones she wrote to me but never sent, and some to you, I think, written during her illness. The expression that crossed Patch's face was pure pain. He set the letters aside without opening them, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining control. "Can't read those yet," he said. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Evelyn understood. The immediate grief was still too raw, too overwhelming. Reading Clara's final thoughts would be like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. "There's something else," she said, pulling out the last item. "She was working on this for your cabin." The unfinished quilt seemed to fill the room with Clara's presence. Patch stared at it for a long moment, then reached out to touch the careful stitching with fingers that trembled slightly. "She said it would keep the drafts out," he said. "Always complaining about how cold the mornings were, but she wouldn't let me add another blanket to the bed. Said this would be better because she made it herself. She was proud of learning to sew," Evelyn said. In her letters, she wrote about how satisfying it was to create something useful with her own hands. She was proud of a lot of things she learned up here: canning vegetables, tending the garden, helping with difficult births. Your sister discovered she was stronger than anyone ever told her she could be. There was something in his voice, admiration mixed with loss, that made Evelyn look at him more carefully. This was not just a man mourning his lover. This was someone who had witnessed and celebrated another person's transformation into their truest self. "I want to understand what she found here," Evelyn said. "Not just the facts of her life, but what made her choose to stay." Patch was quiet for a long time, studying the quilt with its progression from delicate silk to sturdy wool. When he spoke, his voice carried a gentleness she was beginning to recognize as his natural tone beneath the defensive gruffness. "Understanding takes time and work. Mountain life doesn't reveal itself to visitors, only to people willing to earn their place in it." He looked at her directly. "You planning to stay long enough for that kind of learning?" "I don't know," Evelyn admitted, "but I'm willing to try." Patch nodded slowly. "Then you'd better start by learning to split kindling properly. What you did yesterday would get you through maybe one cold snap, but winter up here lasts 6 months. It was, Evelyn realized, an invitation of sorts, not warm perhaps, but genuine. Patch McKenna was offering to teach her some small part of what Clara had learned. The question was whether she possessed the courage and determination to be a worthy student. October's end brought the first serious snowfall, arriving 3 days earlier than even the mountain veterans had predicted. Evelyn woke in her boarding house room to find the world transformed, every tree branch, fence post, and rooftop outlined in pristine white, the mountains themselves disappearing into low-hanging clouds that promised more snow to come. Martha knocked on her door before dawn. "Storm's moving in fast," she said without preamble. "Doc Harrison thinks it might trap folks up the mountain for days. You planning to visit Patch today? You'd better get going now." Evelyn dressed quickly in her warmest borrowed clothes, adding an extra wool shawl that Martha pressed into her hands. The general store was already bustling with people buying last-minute supplies, their faces showing the serious concern of people who understood what mountain winter could mean. She purchased coffee, flour, and salt pork with money from her carefully hoarded funds, then loaded everything onto the patient horse Martha had arranged for her to borrow. The trail to Patch's cabin, normally a pleasant hour's ride, became a struggle against wind and swirling snow. The horse picked its way carefully through drifts that were already ankle-deep, and more than once Evelyn had to dismount and lead the animal around fallen branches. By the time she reached the cabin, her face was numb with cold, and her hands could barely grip the reins. Patch met her at the barn, his expression grim. "Shouldn't have come up in this weather," he said, but his hands were gentle as he helped her down from the horse. "Storm's going to be a bad one." "I brought supplies," Evelyn said through chattering teeth. "Martha thought you might need them. Martha worries too much." But Patch's tone was fond as he led the horse into the barn's warmth. "Though I appreciate the coffee. Been making do with chicory for weeks." Inside the cabin, Clara's music box sat open on the mantelpiece, its delicate melody competing with the wind that was beginning to howl around the eaves. Patch had built up the fire until it roared in the stone fireplace, and the room was blessedly warm after the bitter ride. "How long will the storm last?" Evelyn asked, unwrapping the supplies she had brought. "Could be days, could be a week." Patch hung her wet cloak near the fire and gestured toward Clara's room. "You'll have to stay here. No getting back to town in this weather." The implications of spending days alone in the cabin with Patch McKenna should have scandalized Evelyn, but instead she felt only relief. The prospect of being trapped here, away from Boston's expectations and Martha's well-meaning supervision, was oddly liberating. "I don't want to impose. Clara would haunt this cabin if I let her sister freeze too. Death for the sake of propriety." Patch's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Besides, extra hands are useful when the snow gets serious." Over the next hour, as the storm intensified outside, Evelyn discovered that serious was an understatement. The wind drove snow against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass, and the temperature dropped so quickly that frost began forming on the inside of the panes despite the roaring fire. Patch moved through his preparations with the calm efficiency of long experience. He brought in extra firewood, checked the food stores, and sealed gaps around the windows with rags and melted wax. Evelyn watched, fascinated by the methodical way he approached each task. "Show me how to help," she said. Patch glanced at her with surprise. "You sure? This isn't drawing room work." "I'm sure." He set her to grinding coffee beans with a hand mill, a task that proved more difficult than it looked. Her soft hands were unaccustomed to the repetitive motion, and she had to stop frequently to rest. But Patch didn't offer to take over, instead showing her how to brace the mill properly and use her whole body's strength rather than just her arms. "Clara couldn't grind enough coffee for 1 cup when she first tried that," he said, watching Evelyn's improved technique. "Took her 3 weeks to build up the strength. Course, she was too stubborn to ask for help." "Sounds like Clara." Evelyn paused in her grinding, struck by a memory. "When we were children, she spent an entire summer trying to learn to whistle, drove our governess to distraction. But she kept at it until she could whistle any tune perfectly. She still could. Used to whistle while she worked in the garden, little tunes I'd never heard before. When I asked where she learned them, she said she made them up as she went along." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the storm raging outside while the cabin remained warm and secure. Evelyn found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple tasks: grinding coffee, tending the fire, preparing a meal from basic ingredients. As evening approached, Patch began cooking dinner. Salt pork fried with potatoes and onions, simple fare that tasted better than any elaborate Boston meal Evelyn could remember. They ate at the pine table Clara had used, drinking coffee that Evelyn had ground herself. "Tell me about the war," Evelyn said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Patch's fork paused halfway to his mouth. For a moment she thought he would refuse to answer, but then he set down his utensil and leaned back in his chair. "What do you want to know? How you lost your eye? What it was like? How you came home and rebuilt your life?" "That's a lot of questions. Clara wrote that you don't talk about it much. But she said it shaped who you became, and I want to understand who you are." Patch studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could be trusted with the truth. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, making the cabin feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. "Gettysburg," he said finally. "3rd day of fighting. Artillery shell landed close enough to take my eye and most of the hearing in my left ear. Should have killed me outright, but sometimes luck runs strange." "Were you afraid?" "Terrified. Every day for 3 years. But fear doesn't excuse a man from doing what needs doing." He touched the leather patch unconsciously. "Lost my brother Jimmy in that same battle. He was 18, full of ideas about glory and heroism, died in a cornfield, calling for our mother." Evelyn felt tears threatening at the quiet pain in his voice. "I'm sorry. War taught me that life can change in an instant, that everything you think is permanent can disappear while you're not paying attention. Patch picked up his fork again, but didn't eat. When I came home and found everything gone, the land, my parents, the life I'd expected to have, it wasn't really a surprise. Just confirmation of what I'd already learned. But you rebuilt. Had to. Giving up would have been disrespectful to Jimmy's memory, to all the boys who didn't make it home. He met her eyes directly. Clara understood that. She knew about loss, about having to start over when everything familiar gets taken away. The comparison hung in the air between them. Evelyn thought about her own losses, Charles's death, the suffocating expectations of Boston society, the growing realization that her entire life had been lived according to other people's plans. Perhaps that was what Clara had seen in Patch. Someone who understood that sometimes starting over was the only way to truly live. The storm continued through the night, and Evelyn fell asleep in Clara's bed, listening to the wind and Patch's quiet movements as he tended the fire. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The storm trapped them for 4 days, and in that time Evelyn discovered muscles she never knew she possessed. Patch worked her harder than any Boston servant would have dared, teaching her to split kindling with proper form, to bank fires so they would burn through the night, to prepare meals that provided real nutrition rather than mere refinement. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of leisure, developed blisters that broke and hardened into calluses. "Good," Patch said on the third morning, examining her grip on the axe handle. "You're starting to use your whole body instead of just your arms." Clara made the same mistake at first thought. Strength came from muscle instead of technique. It was the kind of casual comparison that had become frequent between them, these references to Clara's own learning process. Instead of painful reminders of loss, they were beginning to feel like shared memories, ways of keeping Clara's presence alive in the cabin where she had been so happy. On the fourth morning, Evelyn woke to silence. The wind had died during the night, and pale sunlight streamed through windows, no longer rattled by driving snow. When she emerged from Clara's room, she found Patch already dressed and preparing to venture outside. "Storm's broken," he said, "but it'll be at least another day before the trail to town is passable. Good thing, because we've got work to do." The work proved to be checking on Patch's neighbors, isolated families scattered throughout the mountain valleys who might need assistance after the storm. Evelyn learned that this was simply what people did here. When weather threatened, everyone looked after everyone else. It was a form of community care that Boston society, for all its charity committees and formal philanthropy, had never quite managed. Their first stop was the Brennan homestead, a modest cabin where Tom Brennan lived with his wife Mary and their 3 young children. Tom had injured his leg the previous month, and Patch was concerned about their fuel supply. "Patch!" Mary Brennan called as they approached, her face bright with relief. "Thank goodness. Tom's been fretting about the woodpile for days." Evelyn watched as Patch assessed the family's situation with quiet efficiency. Their firewood was running low, one of the children was showing signs of a head cold, and their milk cow was acting strangely. Within minutes, Patch had organized a plan. He would split firewood while Mary and Evelyn checked on the cow, and Tom, despite his bad leg, could help by sorting the split wood into sizes. "Mrs. Hargrave," Mary said as they walked to the barn, "I'm so glad you've come to visit our mountains. Clara spoke of you often. She said you had a gift for organizing people and making things run smoothly." The cow, it turned out, was simply responding to the storm's disruption of her normal routine. But as Evelyn helped Mary with the morning milking, she found herself genuinely interested in the practical challenges of mountain life. How did you keep milk from freezing in winter? What signs indicated that a cow was truly ill versus merely unsettled? How did you manage a household when the nearest doctor was hours away and the nearest store was even farther? "Clara asked me the same questions when she first came up here," Mary said, noting Evelyn's curiosity. "Course, She was asking them while trying to milk a cow for the first time and getting more milk on herself than in the bucket. Did she learn quickly? Quick enough. But more important, she learned to ask for help when she needed it. That's harder for some folks than learning the skills themselves. As they worked, Evelyn found herself thinking about a conversation she had overheard between Tom and Patch. They were discussing something called a boundary stone, an old surveyor's marker that apparently had some significance for land claims in the area. The way they talked about it suggested something more complex than simple property boundaries. When she asked Patch about it on the ride to their next stop, his expression grew troubled. "Old survey markers from when the territory was first mapped," he explained. "Problem is, some of the original surveys were done wrong, and now there's talk of railroad companies challenging land claims based on the mistakes. What does that mean for people like the Brennans? Could mean they lose their homestead, could mean all of us lose our land if some Eastern company decides to push the issue." Patch's jaw tightened. There's been talk of surveyors working for the railroad, checking property lines and looking for discrepancies. The implications were sobering. These families had built their lives on land they believed they owned legally, had invested years of backbreaking work in clearing fields and building homes. The idea that corporate interests could simply sweep in and claim ownership based on old paperwork seemed fundamentally unjust. Their next stop was the elderly Henderson couple, whose cabin sat in a particularly isolated valley. Mrs. Henderson, a tiny woman with steel-grey hair, greeted them with obvious relief. "Harold's been poorly since the storm started," she said. "Chest pains and trouble breathing. I've been worried sick." Patch examined the old man with the kind of practical medical knowledge that mountain dwellers developed by necessity. Probably the altitude and the cold air, he concluded, but he should see Doc Harrison when the trail's clear. As they helped Mrs. Henderson with her chores, Evelyn learned that Harold Henderson had been one of the original settlers in the valley, arriving more than 30 years ago when the area was truly wilderness. The boundary stone issue was particularly troubling for the Hendersons because their land claim was based on some of the oldest and potentially most problematic surveys. "Been here longer than some trees," Mrs. Henderson said, watching her husband rest by the fire. "Built this place with our own hands, raised 6 children here, buried 2. Now they're telling us we might not even own it?" The injustice of the situation stirred something in Evelyn that she had not expected. These were good people who had earned their place through hard work and sacrifice. The idea that distant corporations could disrupt their lives for profit was infuriating in a way that Boston society's petty cruelties had never been. On the ride back to Patch's cabin, Evelyn found herself thinking about Clara's unfinished business in a new way. Her sister had not simply found personal happiness in the mountains, she had found a community worth defending, a way of life worth preserving. Clara was involved in the land issue, wasn't she? Evelyn asked. Patch nodded grimly. She was helping people understand their legal rights, writing letters to territorial officials, organizing meetings. Your sister had a head for that kind of work, saw patterns and connections that other folks missed. What happened to that work when she died? Stopped, mostly. Nobody else had Clara's education or her way with words. People are still worried, but they don't know what to do about it. As they approached Patch's cabin in the gathering dusk, Evelyn felt a strange sense of purpose beginning to form. Clara had found meaningful work here, something that mattered beyond personal satisfaction. Perhaps that was part of what Evelyn was searching for, not just understanding of her sister's choices, but a way to honor Clara's legacy by continuing what she had started. The boundary stone issue was complex, but Evelyn had spent years managing her late husband's business affairs. She understood legal documents, correspondence, and the kind of methodical organization that complex problems required. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, she began to see how her Boston-bred skills might be genuinely useful in this new world. The question was whether she had the courage to commit to something that would require her to stay indefinitely, to make the mountains her home as Clara had done. It was while cleaning Clara's music box that Evelyn made the discovery that would change everything. The delicate mechanism had been sticking, playing its waltz in halting, discordant notes that pained her to hear. Patch had been working in his shop, and the cabin was quiet except for the soft sounds of her careful work with a small brush and oil. The music box was more complex than it had appeared at first glance. As Evelyn lifted out the tiny dancing figures to clean the base, she noticed that the velvet lining seemed oddly thick in one corner. Curious, she pressed gently and felt something shift beneath the fabric. Working carefully with her fingernails, she managed to lift a corner of the lining. Underneath lay a folded letter, the paper thin and yellowed with age. Clara's handwriting was immediately recognizable, but the date made Evelyn's hands tremble. February 10th, 1875, just days before Clara's death. "My dearest Evelyn," the letter began, and Evelyn sank into Patch's chair by the fire to read. "If you are reading this, then my plan has worked, and you have come to find Patch as I hoped you would. I know this will come as a shock, but I have been writing to you for months, preparing letters that I never sent, waiting for the right moment to reveal what I had discovered here. I am dying, sister. The fever that has taken so many this winter has claimed me as well, though I suspect I have perhaps days rather than hours remaining. Doc Harrison has been kind but honest about my prospects. Do not grieve over much. I have lived more truly in these past 3 years than in all the decades that came before. But I did not hide this letter simply to bid you farewell. I hid it because I need you to understand something crucial. Your journey here was not accidental. Every letter I sent you was carefully crafted to plant seeds of curiosity about this life I had chosen. Every description of mountain sunrises and community gatherings was designed to show you what you were missing in Boston's gilded cage. You think you came here to understand my choices, but the truth is far more complex. I brought you here because I could see what you could not. That you were dying by inches in that beautiful prison Charles left you, that your generous heart was withering from lack of purpose, that your considerable intelligence was being wasted on social obligations that meant nothing to anyone. I brought you here because Patch McKenna is going to need someone to help him heal after I am gone. Oh, he will tell you he prefers solitude, will insist that he has no need for companionship. But I have watched this good man struggle with loneliness and grief, and I know that isolating himself is not the answer. He needs someone who can see past his scars to the gentle soul beneath, someone with the patience to wait while he learns to trust again. More than that, this community needs someone with your skills, Evelyn. The land troubles I wrote about are worse than I let on. Railroad companies are actively challenging property claims throughout the territory, using legal technicalities and political influence to seize land from families who have worked it for decades. These good people need an advocate who understands law and business, who can write persuasive letters and organize effective resistance. I started that work, but my time is ending. You could finish it if you chose to stay. You could make a difference here in ways that Boston society would never allow. But most importantly, dear sister, you could find yourself here as I found myself. You could discover what it means to live according to your own values rather than others' expectations, to work with your hands as well as your mind, to be part of something larger than your own comfort. I know what I am asking of you seems impossible. I know that choosing this life would mean giving up everything familiar, accepting hardships you have never imagined, possibly facing family ostracism and social ruin. But I also know that you are braver than you believe yourself to be, more capable than Boston ever demanded you become. Patch will resist my matchmaking, of course. He will see accepting help as a betrayal of my memory, will convince himself that caring for someone else dishonors what we shared. You must be patient with him. Help him understand that love is not a finite resource that diminishes when shared, but rather something that grows stronger when given freely. As for you, my darling sister, you must learn to forgive yourself for wanting more than the life you have been given. There is no shame in admitting that comfort is not enough, that security without purpose is its own kind of poverty. You have spent your entire life taking care of others. Charles, his family, our family, countless charity cases who never truly needed your help. Here, you could take care of people who genuinely depend on your assistance, who would value your efforts because they make a real difference in their daily lives. I have watched you for 35 years, Evelyn, have seen you sacrifice your own dreams again and again for the sake of others' comfort. Now, I am asking you to be selfish for once in your life. Choose happiness, choose purpose, choose love, if it comes to you. The boundary stone I mentioned in my previous letters marks land that I have been slowly purchasing with money saved from my Boston inheritance. The deed is in the locked box beneath my bed, along with enough funds to complete the purchase. If you stay, that land could be your foundation for building a new life. If you leave, please ensure it goes to Patch. He deserves the security of owning the valley he has come to love. I do not know if you will have the courage to make the choice I am asking of you, but I know that if you do, you will discover reserves of strength and joy that you never suspected you possessed. You will find, as I found, that the person you become in these mountains is the person you were always meant to be. Take care of Patch for me, if you can. Take care of yourself, always. And remember that love, real love, honest love, is worth any sacrifice required to achieve it. All my faith in your courage. Clara, P.S. The key to my locked box is sewn into the lining of my green wool dress. Patch has never looked through my belongings carefully enough to find it. His grief makes him treat my room like a shrine. You will have to be the one to discover what I have left for you both. Evelyn read the letter 3 times before the full implications settled into her mind. Clara had orchestrated everything, not just Evelyn's journey west, but her meeting with Patch, their growing friendship, even the timing of her arrival as winter approached. Every conversation they had shared, every moment of connection, had been guided by Clara's careful planning. The sound of Patch's footsteps on the cabin porch broke through her shock. Quickly, she folded the letter and slipped it into her dress pocket, but she could not compose her expression quickly enough to hide her emotional turmoil. "What's wrong?" Patch asked the moment he entered, his eyes sharp with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had. Clara's voice in the letter had been so clear, so unmistakably her sister's mixture of practicality and romantic idealism, that Evelyn could almost believe Clara was standing in the room with them. "I found something," Evelyn said carefully. "In the music box. A letter Clara left for me." Patch's expression grew wary. "What kind of letter?" "One that explains why I really came here, why she wanted me to find you." Evelyn pulled the letter from her pocket with hands that shook slightly. "Patch, Clara didn't just love you. She planned for us to meet. She brought me here deliberately, knowing you would need help after she was gone." The look that crossed Patch's face was complex surprise, pain, and something that might have been relief or might have been betrayal. He sank into the chair opposite her, suddenly looking older than his years. "She what?" "Everything she wrote in her letters to me, every story about mountain life, every mention of your name, it was all designed to make me curious enough to come here. She knew she was dying, and she wanted to make sure neither of us would be alone." Patch was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers to questions he had not known he was asking. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "That sounds like Clara. Always thinking 10 steps ahead, always trying to take care of everyone, whether they wanted taking care of or not." He looked at Evelyn directly. "How does it make you feel, knowing you were manipulated into coming here?" It was a fair question, and one Evelyn had been asking herself since finishing the letter. Was she angry at Clara's deception, relieved to understand the forces that had brought her west? grateful for her sister's concern or resentful of being treated like a chess piece in Clara's final game. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know that Clara was right about one thing. I was dying by inches in Boston. Whether she tricked me into leaving or not, I needed to leave." Patch nodded slowly. "And the rest of it? About us needing each other, about you staying to help with the land troubles?" Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I think Clara saw things we weren't ready to see ourselves. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge now?" The silence that followed was heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Two people confronting the reality that their growing connection had been guided by someone who loved them both enough to gamble their happiness on her own judgment. The discovery of Clara's land deed changed everything. Hidden in the locked box beneath her bed, along with nearly $3,000 in carefully saved inheritance money, was a legal document that made Evelyn's heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. Clara had been systematically purchasing a substantial tract of land adjacent to Patch's property, 160 acres of mountain valley that included water rights, timber stands, and some of the best grazing land in the territory. "She never said a word," Patch said, staring at the deed with amazement. "All those trips to town, all those meetings with lawyers and surveyors, I thought she was just helping other folks with their land troubles." "She was," Evelyn replied, studying the careful notes Clara had made in the margins of legal documents. "But she was also building something for the future. Look at these survey maps. The land she bought creates a buffer around the entire community. If the railroad wants to build through this valley, they'll have to negotiate with whoever owns this deed." The implications were staggering. Clara had not just found happiness in the mountains, she had positioned herself to protect the community that had welcomed her. And now she was asking Evelyn to carry on that work, to use her Boston education and business experience to defend people who had become family. But before Evelyn could fully process what Clara was asking of her, the outside world intruded with devastating efficiency. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a rider who arrived at Patch's cabin 3 days after the letter's discovery. Young Billy Hendricks, barely 16 and breathless from a hard ride, brought news that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "Railroad surveyors," Billy gasped, accepting the cup of coffee Patch pressed into his hands. "Showed up at the Henderson place yesterday with a sheriff and a stack of legal papers. They're claiming the old man's land claim is invalid, saying the original survey was wrong and his property belongs to the territorial government now." Patch's expression grew grimmer as Billy continued his report. The surveyors had similar papers for at least 6 other families, including the Brennans, all based on alleged errors in the original territorial surveys, all citing the same legal precedent, all demanding immediate evacuation, pending resolution through the territorial courts. "Harold Henderson near had another heart attack," Billy said. "His wife was crying so hard she couldn't speak. They're saying folks have 30 days to challenge the claims in territorial court, but you know none of us has money for lawyers or time to travel to the capital." After Billy left to spread the word to other families, Evelyn and Patch sat in the cabin's main room, surrounded by Clara's legal documents and maps. The carefully planned defense Clara had been building suddenly seemed more urgent than ever. "The timing isn't coincidental," Evelyn said, tracing property lines on one of Clara's maps. "They waited until after the first hard storm, when travel is difficult and people are focused on survival rather than legal challenges. By spring, they expect to have clear title to half the valley." "Can they do that? Legally, I mean?" Evelyn had been asking herself the same question for hours, drawing on her experience managing Charles's business affairs and the legal knowledge she had accumulated through years of handling estate matters. Possibly. Territorial law is complex, and the railroad companies have resources to challenge surveys that were done quickly and sometimes carelessly 30 years ago. But Clara was building a strong counter-argument. She spread out the documents Clara had compiled, correspondence with territorial officials, copies of original survey records, testimony from early settlers about the establishment of property lines. It was meticulous work that revealed Clara's sharp intellect and growing understanding of Western law. She was fighting this before she got sick, Evelyn continued. See these letters to the territorial governor? She was arguing that 30 years of continuous habitation and improvement should take precedence over survey discrepancies. And she was organizing other territorial communities facing similar challenges. So what do we do now? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Patch was including her in the fight, accepting that she had become part of the community's defense, whether she had originally planned to or not. Before Evelyn could answer, another rider appeared. This one, Martha Kellerman, her face grim with news that made the situation even more urgent. Railroad men are in town, Martha announced without preamble. Whole delegation of them, with a legal representative from back east. They're saying they'll buy out any valid claims at fair market prices, but families with disputed titles have to accept whatever compensation the DLP. Territorial court awards. How much are they offering? Patch asked. $5 an acre for cleared land, $2 for timber rights. And that's only if folks can prove their titles are completely clean. Martha's expression showed what she thought of those prices. Most families have invested 20 times that much in improvements alone. Evelyn did quick calculations in her head. The railroad's offers were insultingly low enough to cover basic moving expenses, but nowhere near the value of established homesteads. Families would lose their homes, their livelihoods, and their community, all for the sake of corporate expansion. There's more, Martha continued. They're holding a meeting tomorrow night at the town hall, mandatory for anyone with disputed land claims. Sheriff's orders. After Martha left, Evelyn found herself pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Everything Clara had worked for, everything these families had built, was being systematically dismantled by people who had never set foot in the territory until they smelled profit. I need to see those original surveys, she said suddenly. The ones the railroad is claiming are wrong, and I need to understand exactly what legal precedent they're citing. Patch looked at her with something that might have been hope. You think you can find a way to fight this? I think Clara believed I could, or she wouldn't have left me all this information. Evelyn gestured at the papers scattered across the table. She was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. But she ran out of time. And you're thinking of finishing what she started. It was a statement rather than a question, and Evelyn realized that somewhere in the past few hours, her decision had been made. These people had welcomed Clara with open arms, had given her the community and purpose she had craved. They had been kind to Evelyn despite her obvious foreignness, had shared their knowledge and trusted her with their stories. The idea of watching them lose everything to corporate greed was intolerable. I'm thinking that I have skills Clara didn't have, Evelyn said. I understand business law, corporate tactics, the kind of legal maneuvering the railroad is using, and I have something else Clara didn't have when she started this fight. What's that? I have the land deed she assembled, which gives me legal standing to challenge the railroad's claims. And I have enough money to hire proper legal representation if necessary. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to Patch's cabin as word spread about Evelyn's intentions. The Henderson family arrived first, Harold still pale from the stress of the previous day, but determined to understand his options. The Brennans came next, with their 3 children in tow and worry lines etched deep around Mary's eyes. By midday, nearly 20 adults were crowded into the cabin, drinking coffee and discussing strategy with the kind of desperate intensity that came from having everything at stake. Evelyn found herself in the strange position of being both the newest member of the community and its most experienced advocate. The key, she explained, spreading out Clara's maps on the table, is proving that the original surveys were not actually wrong, just different from what modern surveying techniques would produce. 30 years ago, surveyors used different methods, different tools. The discrepancies the railroad is citing might be within acceptable margins of error for the time period. But how do we prove that? Tom Brennan asked. We're not surveyors or lawyers. We hire experts. We challenge their findings with our own technical evidence. And we use the political pressure that Clara was building with other territorial communities. Evelyn pulled out a thick folder of correspondence. Clara was in contact with settlers facing similar challenges throughout Montana Territory. If we can coordinate our defense, present a united front, we have a much better chance of success. The discussion continued for hours, covering everything from legal technicalities to practical logistics. Who could travel to the territorial capital? How would they fund expert witnesses? What timeline were they working with before the railroad's claims became final? As the afternoon wore on, Evelyn found herself energized in a way she had not experienced since her early days managing Charles's business interests. This was work that mattered, that would make a real difference in people's lives. The complex legal and political challenges were exactly the kind of problems her mind was designed to solve. But even as she threw herself into the planning, part of her was acutely aware of Patch's quiet presence at the edge of the group. He contributed practical knowledge when asked, offered his cabin as a meeting place, and made it clear that he supported whatever decision the community made. But she could see the weight of worry in his expression, the fear that he was about to lose not just his neighbors, but also the woman who had brought new purpose to his carefully ordered life. That evening, after the last neighbor had departed and they were alone again, Patch finally voiced what had been unspoken all day. If you do this, if you really take on the railroad and the territorial government, there's no going back to Boston. You'll be committed to this life, this place, these people. Are you ready for that? Evelyn looked around the cabin that had become so familiar, at Clara's quilt draped over the back of a chair, at the legal documents that represented both challenge and opportunity. Through the window, she could see the mountains outlined against a star-filled sky, and somewhere in those peaks, the land that Clara had left her waited to be claimed or abandoned. I think, she said slowly, that I've been ready for longer than I realized. The question is whether you're ready to have me stay. The silence that followed held all the weight of Clara's unfinished plans and their own growing feelings, a moment balanced on the edge of transformation that would define the rest of their lives. The town hall had never seen anything like it. Railroad representatives in expensive suits sat at a table near the front, flanked by a territorial sheriff and a lawyer whose briefcase probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Behind them, nearly every adult in Pine Ridge filled the wooden benches, their faces showing the kind of grim determination that came from having everything they had built hanging in the balance. Evelyn entered the hall wearing her finest remaining Boston dress, dark blue silk with pearl buttons that caught the lamplight, and carrying a leather portfolio that contained Clara's carefully assembled legal documents. She had chosen her appearance deliberately, knowing that first impressions mattered in legal confrontations. Let the railroad men see that they were not dealing with uneducated frontier families, but with someone who understood their world. Patch walked beside her, his own appearance transformed by a clean white shirt and his best wool jacket. The leather eye patch he usually wore had been replaced by a newer one that spoke of dignity rather than damage. He carried himself with military bearing, reminding everyone present that he was a man who had faced down Confederate artillery and lived to tell about it. "Mrs. Hargrave," the railroad's lawyer said as they approached the front of the hall, his tone carefully neutral. "I understand you've appointed yourself spokesman for the disputed landowners. I'm Henry Caldwell, representing the Montana and Pacific Railroad Company. Legal representative," Evelyn corrected smoothly. "Acting under power of attorney for multiple property holders in this valley." It was not entirely true yet, but the formal language served its purpose. Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly, reassessing his opposition. The meeting began with Caldwell presenting the railroad's position with practiced efficiency. Survey discrepancies, territorial law precedents, the need for proper documentation, all delivered in language designed to overwhelm rather than inform. Several families shifted uncomfortably as technical terms flew over their heads, and Evelyn could see doubt beginning to creep into faces around the room. When Caldwell finished his presentation, he looked directly at Evelyn. "Now, Mrs. Hargrave, I understand you have some questions about our findings." Evelyn rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment Clara had been preparing her for, whether either of them had known it at the time. She opened her portfolio and pulled out the first document. "Mr. Caldwell, your survey discrepancy claims are based on the assumption that 1,840 seconds surveying techniques should match modern precision standards. However, territorial law clearly states that original survey markers take precedence over resurvey findings when the original markers can be verified." She handed him a copy of the relevant statute. "I believe you'll find this referenced in Territory of Montana versus Consolidated Mining 1873. Caldwell's confident expression flickered as he scanned the document. Behind him, one of the railroad representatives leaned forward to whisper urgently in his ear. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall, "the survey discrepancies you cite fall well within acceptable margins of error for 1,840 seconds equipment. I have expert testimony from the Territorial Surveyor's Office confirming this." That was a bluff. She had sent letters requesting such testimony, but had not yet received responses. But Caldwell could not know that, and his hesitation told her the bluff was working. "The most significant issue," Evelyn pressed on, pulling out Clara's maps, "is that your resurvey conveniently ignores established boundary markers that have been recognized by the territorial government for 30 years. The Henderson property, for example, includes a boundary stone that appears on official territorial maps dating to 1847. She spread the map on the table between them, pointing to the carefully marked locations Clara had documented. "Unless you're suggesting that the territorial government has been recognizing invalid property lines for 3 decades, these markers establish clear legal precedent for existing claims." The murmur that ran through the crowd was hopeful rather than worried now. Evelyn could see understanding dawning on faces around the room. She was not just challenging the railroad's findings, she was dismantling them systematically. Caldwell recovered his composure quickly, but there was wariness in his eyes now. "Mrs. Hargrave, while your legal research is thorough, the simple fact remains that the Montana and Pacific Railroad has received territorial authorization for this route. Individual property disputes must be resolved through proper legal channels, which is exactly what we intend to do." Evelyn reached into her portfolio for the final document, the one that would change everything. "I am formally challenging these survey findings on behalf of the collective landowners, and I am prepared to file a comprehensive brief with the territorial court within 30 days. She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the blow that Clara had made possible. "Additionally, as the legal owner of 160 acres of strategically located property in this valley, I am prepared to use every legal means at my disposal to protect not only my own interests, but those of my neighbors." She placed Clara's land deed on the table. "The railroad's proposed route runs directly through land that I now own free and clear, with verified surveys and territorial registration dating to last year." The silence that followed was profound. Caldwell stared at the deed, his face pale as he realized that his carefully planned legal coup had just encountered an obstacle his employers had not anticipated. The families around the room were looking at Evelyn with expressions ranging from amazement to outright admiration. "You're bluffing," Caldwell said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Evelyn smiled with the kind of cold confidence she had learned watching Charles negotiate business deals. "I suggest you contact your employers and inform them that the Montana and Pacific Railroad has just encountered its first serious legal challenge in this territory. And Mr. Caldwell, I spent 15 years managing my late husband's business interests in Boston. I know exactly how to make this process as expensive and time-consuming as possible. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and everyone in the room understood that the balance of power had just shifted dramatically. The celebration at Martha's boarding house that night felt like a victory party, but Evelyn knew it was premature. She had won the first battle, but the railroad would not give up easily. As neighbors thanked her with tears in their eyes and voices thick with emotion, she was already planning the next steps in what would likely be a long legal campaign. "You did it," Mary Brennan said, gripping Evelyn's hands with calloused fingers. "I've never seen anyone talk to those fancy men like that. You made them listen." "We all did it," Evelyn replied, though she felt the weight of what she had committed to. "This is just the beginning." But even as she spoke to the gathered families, part of her attention was on Patch, who stood near the boarding house window, watching the snow that had begun to fall again. His expression was unreadable, and she realized that while she had been focused on the legal battle, he had been confronting his own crisis. When the last neighbor had departed and they were finally alone, walking back toward his cabin through the swirling snow, Patch broke the silence that had stretched between them all evening. "That was Clara's Boston ring you sold to pay for the legal documents, wasn't it?" Evelyn looked down at her bare finger, where her grandmother's sapphire ring had rested for as long as she could remember. She had sold it that afternoon to the town's only jeweler, using the money to pay for express telegrams to territorial officials and copies of legal documents. The ring had been worth more than most families in Pine Ridge saw in a year, but it had seemed a small price to pay for the community's future. "How did you know?" Clara described it in one of her letters, said it represented everything about Boston society that made her feel trapped. Patch stopped walking and turned to face her. "She also said you'd never part with it unless something mattered more to you than your old life." The snow fell around them in the lamplight from town, creating a private world where only truth seemed possible. Evelyn realized that this was the moment Clara had been orchestrating from the beginning, not just the legal victory, but this choice between worlds, between the woman she had been and the woman she could become. "It did matter more," she said simply. "These people matter more. This place matters more. And us?" Patch's voice was quiet, uncertain. "Do we matter more?" It was the question that had been hanging between them for weeks, complicated by grief and guilt, and Clara's ghostly presence in every conversation. But standing there in the snow, with the taste of victory still fresh and the knowledge of Clara's blessing finally clear, Evelyn found that the answer was remarkably simple. "Yes," she said. "We matter more than anything I've ever known." Patch closed the distance between them with 2 quick steps, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that belied his scarred appearance. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of a man who had thought himself beyond the reach of happiness, who had discovered that love could come twice in one lifetime if he was brave enough to accept it. "Clara knew," he said against her lips. "Somehow she knew we'd need each other. She knew us better than we knew ourselves." Evelyn rested her forehead against his, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and mountain air that clung to his clothes. "She knew I was dying in Boston, knew you were dying in isolation, knew we could heal each other if we had the chance." They walked the rest of the way to the cabin in comfortable silence, hands linked despite the cold. Inside, Patch built up the fire while Evelyn hung Clara's wedding dress, the artifact that had come to symbolize abandoned traditions on its peg in what would now be their shared bedroom. "I found this in her trunk," Evelyn said, smoothing the ivory silk with careful hands. "I thought I might use the fabric for curtains. Clara would have liked that her old life transformed into something useful for our new one." Patch nodded, understanding the symbolism. She always said pretty things should serve a purpose beyond just being pretty. As they sat together by the fire, Evelyn pulled out the letters she had been drafting to territorial officials, legal experts, and other threatened communities throughout Montana Territory. The fight was far from over. The railroad would bring in more expensive lawyers, would pressure territorial politicians, would use every advantage their money could buy. "Are you ready for what comes next?" she asked. "This won't be easy. We'll be fighting people with resources we can't match, facing legal challenges that could drag on for years." Patch studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination that had impressed even hardened railroad lawyers. "I'm ready for whatever comes, as long as you're with me." "Then we'd better get to work." Evelyn spread the legal documents across the table where Clara's quilt had once lain. "Clara started something here, something worth finishing, but it's going to take everything we have to see it through." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. But inside the cabin, two people who had found each other across the chasm of loss were planning a future that honored the past while building something entirely new. Clara's music box played its gentle waltz in the background, no longer a reminder of what was lost, but a celebration of what had been found. 6 months later, Evelyn stood on the porch of the cabin she and Patch had built together on Clara's land, watching the sun rise over mountains that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The coffee in her hands was strong and bitter, nothing like the delicate China tea she had once preferred, but it tasted of home in a way that Boston's finest imports never had. The new cabin was larger than Patch's original dwelling, designed to accommodate both their needs and the steady stream of neighbors who came seeking legal advice or simply companionship. The foundation stone bore an inscription Patch had carved with his own hands: C, H and E, H and P, M, 1875, a testament to the woman who had brought them together and the life they were building in her memory. The legal battle with the railroad had been won, though not without cost. Evelyn had spent weeks in the territorial capital, arguing before judges and negotiating with politicians who had little understanding of mountain life. The victory had come through a combination of Clara's meticulous research, Evelyn's business experience, and the political pressure generated by similar challenges throughout the territory. The railroad had finally accepted a compromise route that avoided established homesteads, though it had taken nearly all of Clara's inheritance to fund the legal campaign. "You're up early," Patch said, emerging from the cabin with his own cup of coffee. 6 months of shared contentment had softened the hard lines around his eye, and he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "Couldn't sleep," Evelyn replied, leaning into his warmth as he joined her on the porch. "I was thinking about Clara's letter to our family." The letter had arrived the previous week, forwarded through Martha after months of delay. Victoria, Charles's sister, had written in language that managed to be both wounded and condescending, expressing the family's disappointment in Evelyn's abandonment of proper society and their decision to respect her choice to live beyond the bounds of civilized behavior. There had been no mention of Clara, no acknowledgement of the sister who had died far from Boston's drawing rooms. "Any regrets?" Patch asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Evelyn looked across the valley where smoke was beginning to rise from cabin chimneys as their neighbors started their daily routines. The Henderson place, saved from railroad seizure, showed new signs of prosperity as Harold's health improved with the reduction of stress. The Brennan family had expanded their garden and were talking about adding more livestock. Throughout the valley, the community that Clara had helped defend was thriving. "None," she said firmly, "though I think Victoria would faint if she could see me now." It was true. The refined Boston widow had been replaced by a woman whose hands bore calluses from honest work, whose skin had been touched by mountain sun and wind, whose days were filled with purposes that extended far beyond social obligations. Evelyn had learned to preserve vegetables, smoke meat, and assist with difficult childbirths. More importantly, she had established the valley's first school, teaching reading and arithmetic to children who might otherwise have grown up without formal education. "The children are doing well with their letters," she continued, thinking of her. newest project. Mary Brennan's oldest is ready for more advanced mathematics, and the Henderson girl has a real gift for composition. Clara would be proud, Patch said, and it was true. The school had been built on land Clara had purchased, using principles of practical education that Clara had advocated in her correspondence with territorial officials. It was perhaps the most fitting memorial to a woman who had valued learning and community above social status. A rider approached along the valley trail, and Evelyn recognized young Billy Hendricks bringing the weekly mail. Along with letters and newspapers, Billy carried news from the wider territory, updates on political developments, word from other communities facing similar challenges, and occasionally correspondence from former Boston acquaintances who still maintained polite contact despite their obvious bewilderment at her choices. "Mrs. McKenna," Billy called, and Evelyn still felt a small thrill at hearing her new name. The wedding had been simple, conducted by a traveling preacher with the entire valley in attendance. Martha had wept openly, declaring it what Clara would have wanted, and even stern Harold Henderson had admitted it was a sensible arrangement. "Morning, Billy. Any news from the capital?" "Good news, ma'am. That territorial education bill you helped write? It passed committee yesterday. Looks like mountain communities will be getting funding for proper schools after all." Evelyn felt a surge of satisfaction. The bill had been months in the making, requiring careful negotiation and political compromise, but it would ensure that isolated communities could maintain schools without bearing the entire financial burden themselves. It was the kind of practical reform that Clara had envisioned, improving lives through persistent advocacy rather than dramatic gestures. As Billy continued on his rounds, Evelyn and Patch returned to their morning routines. There was firewood to split, animals to tend, and correspondence to write letters to territorial officials, other community leaders, and the network of advocates that Clara had begun building. The work was constant but satisfying in ways that Boston society had never provided. "Do you ever wonder," Patch asked, as they worked together in companionable silence, "what Clara would think of how everything turned out?" Evelyn paused in her letter writing to consider the question. She thought of her sister's final letter, with its mixture of hope and uncertainty, its faith that love and purpose could be found in the most unexpected places. Clara had gambled everything on her belief that both Evelyn and Patch deserved happiness, that they could find in each other what neither had discovered alone. "I think," Evelyn said finally, that she knew exactly how it would turn out. Clara always was the smartest of us all. Evening found them on their porch again, watching stars appear in a sky unmarked by city lights. The mountains rose around them like protective walls, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled not with loneliness, but with the wild contentment of a creature in its proper place. Clara's music box played its gentle waltz from inside the cabin, the melody drifting through windows that were curtained with fabric cut from a wedding dress that had never been worn. It was a sound of memory and celebration, of love that transcended death, and wisdom that guided the living toward unexpected joy. Evelyn Hargrave McKenna had traveled 2,000 miles to find her sister's ghost and discovered instead her own true life. In the quiet satisfaction of that discovery, Clara's greatest gift was finally fully realized.